In this video, in Evony the King's Return, we'll be taking a look at troop layering. For anyone that is unaware of what troop layering is, basically it means creating what may be also known as a meat shield that will protect the higher level troops to some degree in some cases, and will potentially increase your potency, and also just gives it an easier structure for your army. Now, this means sending lower amounts of lower tiers, but sending at least a little bit of all troop types, of all tiers. That means tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and so on. And then obviously sending a larger amount of those higher tiers that you have unlocked, preferably at least tier 10, and then all the way up until tier 14. Now, before we get into some tables that I've made to show what this player on the left here, Korrupt, and a more just basic one, just to make it a little bit easier to understand, I just wanted to mention that I personally do not have the absolute definitive answer on layering and many other topics, so sometimes it takes me a while to make videos and to try to get the information as accurate as I can. I'm not always going to be accurate, and videos will be remade in the future, including this one, to add in additional information. So if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. If you are someone that clearly would know more than me on this matter, bearing in mind that the player we're looking at is about 1 billion power at the moment, and I will be showing a little bit of the chat with him, and my own knowledge of an even lower player than that. If you are higher than that and you have some knowledge on it and you wanted to leave it in the comments down below, do that. And anyone else that wanted to check out the comments just to check if there has been any information posted like that, feel free to look at that. So you see this one is an attack report from Korrupt inside of Battlefield against another player. Now, a lot of things are coming together to make that power loss on Korrupt's side 10 million versus 225 million on the other side. First of all, he's a much higher power player in the first place. He does have, that I'll get into afterwards, better stats, debuffs, and so on. Even with that, troop layering is well shown in his report and is affecting the outcome enough to matter at the very least. Before we actually get into some of those reports from Korrupt, we will actually take a look at a table that I have here. So as you see, I'll go over this other one. So this is kind of a 1 million troop size march table that I've made up. It does look a little messy, but it's the best I could do for now. In yellow on the right side, you're seeing the total amount of each tier between all troop types. On the left side, you are seeing the tiers there. And the total amount of each troop type between all tiers in green at the bottom, and finally in orange the percentages of those total amounts that are in green as well. So just taking a quick look at how I've made it with the ranged march. This is mostly ranged march, as you see, so almost 30% in siege, 65% in ranged. That's not necessarily on purpose, but that's how it worked out. 7% in mounted, and a much lower amount in ground. I'm just going to go through some of my decision making in this. It mostly is just a copy of the Korrupt players thing, where I started off and then edited it after I looked at his report, and we also have a table for that afterwards. Starting with ground, you are seeing tier 1 through tier 10. I have chosen 1,000 of each of those tiers. Again, for ground, this can be scaled down or scaled up depending on the amount of troops that you actually have. And then above that, 2,000 of each, with finally 3,000 tier 14. Now, you can have some of the higher tiers in higher amounts, but it is always good to have, even if you do have a lower march, to actually still have 1,000 of each, as going below that starts to make it pointless, even if you have a fairly low march anyway. I just wanted to mention before we continue, if you have a very low march amount, so this is 250,000 or below, or you don't have tier 10, probably not bother too much with trying to set yourself up properly. Even if you are on tier 11, it may just be a good thing to practice with low amounts of layering, at least in attack. Maybe you can do it in defense, because it's not going to be as worthwhile for those people with lower tier troops and with lower power levels to get into this, but it's good practice and good to have the knowledge anyway to continue watching the video. Now moving on to the mounted, again we're seeing that I'm choosing mostly 1000 of each. You can kind of ignore the fact that I put 2000 and 3000 on some of those lower ones a little bit. I only just did that to get myself closer to the 7% that we'll see in the other sheet in a moment. 50,000 of tier 12, I've done this to help the fact that we have a lot of ranged. That's their weakness. Ground is the ranged weakness. So adding in some mounted that are the effective troop type against ground is going to help you out a little bit. They're not going to do anything crazy. They still probably will get wounded depending on what type of army you're attacking. A lot of different factors come into it, so I can't answer all questions on that type of thing necessarily. And that's the only reason we got that. You don't necessarily need to have some huge amount of those. So the 7% or even 5% is probably going to be okay. Tier 12 is good because they don't necessarily, and this is all troop types, they don't necessarily fight the same way, I've heard from a lot of people, as other troop tiers. They are a little bit more of a wild card, which is a positive to actually have more of those than tier 13, and then quite a lot of T14 also. So that tier 14 are packing the punch in the battle, and T12 will actually rip through enemy layers, so they are a little bit of a counter layer. Although I'm not 100% sure on that, I did get some advice from the player that we're going to show in a moment on that indicated pretty much the same thing. So that's why we've got a lot of tier 12 of mounted, although you can pick tier 10 or whatever. Probably don't go with the higher tiers, seeing as they're going to get wounded anyway if you do have those unlocked. Again, for anyone that does not have those higher tiers, just use your own common sense to be able to change these numbers to reflect that fact. Now moving on to range, we've got more than the other tiers, as you see, layered in, because this is a mostly ranged march, which is going to be good against most players, because most players, especially if you're in a newer server, are going to be using mounted troops. And just in general, a lot of people use mounted troops, and because of the battle mechanics anyway, it tends to be pretty good to use ranged and siege together with a little bit of the other ones. So we've layered in more than double the ranged of each thing. You don't necessarily have to do it, and Korrupt does not do it necessarily for the very low tiers of ranged. He more so starts at 9 or 10, which you can do, perhaps only doing 1000 on the ranged and using that saved troop amount to add it to a higher tier. Coming down to tier 10, we've got 10,000, 40,000, 200,000 on the tier 12, actually half that at 100,000 with tier 13 ranged, and then going back up all the way to 300,000 on the tier 14. Again, I want to stress, you're going to have to figure out your own numbers on this, and most likely people that do have those higher tiers are going to have that figured out a little bit more for their particular setup, their generals and so on, which is best to lean into, whatever you're best on, to lean into that. Bearing in mind that these things might not work for you if you don't have enough siege, if you don't have the stats for siege, or ranged, or whatever it may be. So make sure you play into your strengths, and also try to bring up these other things so you can start using this table to your advantage. Moving on to siege, again 1000 all the way down to tier 10. Then we get a little bit more, get some tier 11 in there, tier 12, tier 13, and tier 14. As we'll see when we switch over to the other table, he's actually chosen just to go for the very high tiers and then not too much of the other ones. Bearing in mind when we go to that table, Korrupt has changed his setup a little bit from this table and the reports we're going to be looking at currently. You'll see in a lot of the reports he's well under 900 million power, but now I think he's like 1.1 billion or something like that. But it's going to be pretty good to send a higher tier of troop when it comes to siege than the lower tiers, but I just layered it in there just to give you a little bit of an idea of what you can do. So going over to the table, this is a complete representation of the report that I had up on screen beforehand from Korrupt. Again, we're seeing a 2% ground, 7% mounted, 60% ranged, and we've got a lot more siege in this one actually. Well, not too much more, but a substantial amount, up to 31%. He's layered in because he has a bigger march, bear that in mind, 2.2 million. The other one we're looking at is about 1 million. He's got 3,000 layered in. I didn't change on the table, so sorry about that, I forgot. But he did layer in, I think, about 3,000 of each on the range, not 2,500. I think he may have ran out of something. It was by accident that caused the tier 8, but he may actually layer in usually some tier 9 or something like that. Tier 10, 25,000. Tier 11, 30,000. 420 on the 12. Not too much below that. On the tier 13 he does have less, and then more again on the tier 14, again for ranged. Siege, you are seeing it's layered the exact same all the way down to tier 12, and then he is layering in those higher tiers. Probably tier 13 has that amount rather than tier 14, just because he was not able to upgrade them, so I assume it's going to be the best to get those tier 14s instead where possible, but you can copy this if you wanted to. Again, these numbers will change over time. It depends on your general, on your stats, and on a lot of different things. So do your own research and figure out the best numbers. This is just a rough guide for everyone to understand what this is. And I'm sure over that time you're able to look through the rest. Again, you are seeing a little bit of mounted in there. Tier 12, he's done the same thing. And just layering in some ground there. He did have some of these low amount of layers not actually in there. I put them in there afterwards just because I assumed that he accidentally killed them or something like that. That meant he didn't send them in the march. But now we'll just actually swap over to the game view and look at this report. So he has 10 million lost. He's attacking another player in Battlefield that ended up losing over 200 million. Again, I want to stress that he does have much more power than the other player, so it's not like troop layering was why he won. He would have won anyway, in most cases. As you see, the stats are quite different. He has more debuffs. But either way, it's a good way to have a look at the troop layering on attack, which we will get into the defense version. So this is just going to be a representation of what we saw in the table. So he's got 430,000 or so tier 14 ranged. Fair few siege. Laid in some ground. His ranged here is probably not an exact science, it's probably just all he had in that tier. A lot more at tier 13 ranged. Again, layering in some ground. Ranged. And so on. All the way down through his tiers, and then obviously sending his subordinate cities also. Now, just to get into some defense reports that we have. So this one was from All Stars Battlefield, I believe. Whistling Pig was attacking Korrupt with a rally with some other players, so 6 million other troops. So with a total of 8.5 million against Korrupt's total of 18 million. Those numbers can be deceiving. He is obviously sending higher tier troops in general, Whistling Pig and the people that are rallying with him against Korrupt. Korrupt does have a lot that you'll see of lower tier troops. And just to look at the stats, just so you understand the difference between the armies, this particular person, again, there's more people in the rally with different stats, has mostly mounted stats on their general against a range, so that's not going to be a good fit against them. The debuffs are not too bad on either side in terms of one being better than the other. So the attacker here is layering in as well things, but they are using a lot of mounted, and they are going up against a more ranged team. And we'll see in a second that we have a lot of siege under the defense from Korrupt also. So you're seeing a lot of mounted being put in there, some siege, so there's not too much of a game plan, it seems, with this. It seems a little bit weird what they've put in. They've got some siege in there layered in, they've got some mounted. So you do have to be careful when layering troops in, when selecting troops, which I will have an additional video that's more so on selecting particular troops, how to understand what you should send against a player. Those things will take time to do because I don't always have time on my hands to be able to do that. But I'll just scroll through now to the defensive setup and show you that. Before I do that, I actually wanted to show you some ralliers here, just to note some other things. So the ranged here is being sent by someone with a ranged general, remembering that the other one had mounted in it, so more range there again. Layering in some things, quite a lot of troops weirdly being layered in, mostly ranged. They got some mounted in here. Again, this person is sending quite a bit of ground and range. The only reason I just wanted to quickly mention some of these people that have joined the rally, there are more below this as well that did similar things. You can't just send mixed marches, you can't just layer in random things and think that it's going to work. You do need to remember your stats, and you do need to remember that when you're attacking people, it's better to stack your stats mostly into one thing, perhaps even siege in addition to that, when attacking, when defending, rather than trying to go with everything. And that's why you also do not send everything. You see a lot of people will send a lot of ranged, even in an alliance rally, so 10 million ranged, layered in with other troop types, ground, and so on, rather than doing a little bit of a weird march like these people did. But now we'll go down to the actual defend portion of the report. And now we're looking at Korrupt's portion of the report. So as you see, it has tier 1 ground ranged at 1 million each, if you add the top two numbers together at least. And as we scroll down, the tiers will not be in order necessarily. I'm not sure why that happens, but do bear that in mind. We're not reading it in order. So that's why you see that he only has 2 tier 1s here, because they are located in the report elsewhere. But tier 2 or even tier 6 here, he's got his 100,000 each on those, even on the ranged here. And that's the kind of thing you're going to see with a lot of people when they are large like this. This player is like 800 million or so at the time. He's now like over 1 billion. They will layer in 100,000 or even up to a 1 million of each troop type on their defense. That's going to allow them to have a bit of a meat shield, and there's a few other battle mechanics things that I'll go into in another video that will help you out more so on defense as well. So there is always a good reason to be doing it, and that's obviously why you see such a large player that was in All Stars Battlefield doing that, and most players do this to some degree. Now, in terms of trying to understand what you should layer in for your level, and depending on your troop tiers and so on that you have unlocked, it's going to be a little bit difficult. Obviously, if you have tier 10 or below, don't bother too much, just do 1,000 of each, and that's just going to be okay just to get started, just to understand it, to get yourself going. Once you get tier 11, tier 12, and especially tier 13, then you could start layering in bare minimum of 5,000 each, preferably 10,000, and then just start pushing that up over time. Even over your hospital capacity is not going to really be an issue, and eventually get to that 100,000. You can probably stay there for quite some time until you push it to 1 million, and by that kind of time you're obviously going to know what you're doing, and then it's not really going to be an issue anymore where you need this video. But we'll continue down, just showing you, for anyone that's interested, exactly what he is layering in. Bearing in mind again, he has changed exactly what he is layering in now is different. These reports are not exactly new. So again, you're seeing like tier 1 or 2 or something, 500,000 mounted. And also, as we scroll through, you are seeing, just to mention about the report itself, a lot of his mounted and ground are being wounded. and that's why it's important to be careful what you send of those two troop types when you're heavy in siege and you're heavy in ranged. They may kill a lot of things, but you're also going to lose your mounted and ground in a lot of cases in these large battles, even if you are able to kill the enemy and get quite a large ratio against them. So do be prepared if you are layering heavy to permanently lose some of those troops if you don't have the hospital capacity to cover them, which may be the case. Now we're starting to get down to tier 13 range that he had. You see, none of them really got wounded or anything like that. That's not entirely because of layering, but it definitely helps to make that happen. You are seeing the ground and even ranged here still getting wounded, obviously, so it doesn't 100% cover you by any means. And some of the siege is getting wounded also, but they're getting a lot of kills. And also you have his traps here, and we'll quickly go down to the reinforcement that he had also. So here he was being reinforced by his teammate. So it was siege, they sent some ground and some ranged, just to kind of take the brunt force with the ground, to have a bit of range in there to help them out, and then they layered in a bunch of siege of most tiers as well. It's not necessarily something you should do, but it is interesting to note how they had done this defense by sending in some range and some ground and siege just to really help out in that defense. And again, just to go up to the top, there are differences in a lot of different things, but you're seeing quite a large ratio between the two, at least given how high this loss is on both sides. It's not even the 2 ratio, obviously people get better than that, as we even saw in Korrupt's last one. This is very good for Battlefield against a larger player that is rallying him, as you see again, over 6 million troops. Now moving on to this particular player's answers to some of my questions. I asked him, just in case, would he use the exact same numbers, but switching the troop types to be it ground, mounted, and so on, depending on what he is attacking. And he said, yes, that's all you're going to be doing, for the most part at least, is switching those troop types over, using the same numbers, obviously remembering to send a little bit more of the counter troop to what counters your main troop. So if you're sending a ranged march, you send mounted, because mounted beat ground, because someone might try to defend against you with ground to kill your ranged. So that's what he said about that. Different, in his words, different counters, same ratios. It works. He also mentioned, I just wanted to point this out, that from the tables that I just showed you, that's going to be good as a kind of guide for those that don't even have T12. But he has actually since then amended his amount that he uses, at least for him, that he's found that's worked. So maybe you could use the other tables, or you could use this, which is different, where he says tier 14 archers, or just in general really, 25%, 25% tier 13, and even 35% of tier 12, excluding layering. He's mentioning that more recently he's been sending 300,000 of each tier 14 and tier 13 archers, with actually 500,000 tier 12 archers, and a little bit of horses, which he does mention a little bit down below, that he only sends a little bit because you send a fair amount of ground or even mounted, they're going to die either way. So the more you send, not really going to have much more of an effect, but they're going to die anyway. So it's going to end up wasting your march size and wasting your resources, depending on exactly where those troops get killed, if it's in Battlefield or elsewhere. And also the tier 12 he sends more of, because, as I mentioned before, can be pretty good at destroying other people's layers, so it's a good counter to that. I have heard that it will, fight differently to other troop types, other troop tiers, and be a little bit more of a wild card in your army, so it's always good to send more of them, and it will be a little bit more likely to save those higher tier troops for defense as well, because you don't want to be killing them all the time. And it's also important to note that, just to make sure, I asked him about mixing troops, and he said that is not going to be recommended. If you're sending archers, you can send siege, as the gear that you use for archers tend to have a little bit of siege stats in there, which is always good. And also a lot of generals will be ranged and siege based, not necessarily only ranged, and so that just means it's a little easier with a lot of different aspects just like that to stack yourself in both ranged and siege. You can go for one or the other if you really wanted to, but you can definitely go for both, and you can attack that way, you can defend that way, and by going for all four instead, that's really going to get your ability to kill other people down, and it's just going to be better, because if you have those generals that have over 1,000% stats in attack based on sending just ranged or siege or whatever it may be, and then you go up against someone that's only got 700%, that's fairly good buffs, but it's nowhere near yours, and you may end up decimating them as a result. So it's always good to buff yourself into one thing, really lean into that with the troops that you train, and obviously you're going to have to be careful and make sure that you get reinforced if need be to cover up any weaknesses you may have, bearing in mind the larger you get, the more likely you are to get rallied against. No one person can necessarily defend by themselves from someone that really wants to kill them, although it is possible. It's not likely for people that are watching this video. Now, if I've left anything out of the video, if I've got anything incorrect or anything could be changed, let me know and let the viewers know down below any information you have. If you have any questions on the matter, leave it down below. I know this is slightly vague in a video, but it's still been pretty long, so I don't want to make it even longer. And as I said, even I'm still learning on the topic, and I'm more than happy to remake this video in future if there's enough information posted below to warrant it, or if I get enough information in future by myself. So thank you for watching. For anyone that hasn't subscribed or hasn't yet checked out my videos, either way, do check those out, do subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it. For those that haven't subscribed before, always remember to click the bell icon so you get notified of when new videos go live. So I do quite often actually release these guides, and be sure to ask down below for any guides that you would like to see in the future. Again, thank you for watching.